Hey nerds! So, I'm going to go through this super long paragraph by Foucault, my favorite post-structuralist 70s pervert philosopher, and his book on the on the order of things. I've also been, of course, done um, a very long series on his book called The History of Sexuality, so check out all of those videos for sure. So, anyway, this is Foucault talking about knowledge, and he almost sees, well, I won't spoil the ending for you. But anyway, so the theory of natural history cannot be dissociated from that of language, and yet so natural history and language are connected, and yet it is not a question of a transference of method from one to the other, nor a communication of concepts, nor of the prestige of a model because it has succeeded in one field has been tried out in the one next to it. Okay, so there's an inexorable connection between natural history and language, but it's not, you don't transfer the method of figuring out natural history to figuring out language. And I think he probably means in terms of natural history, the like the old fashioned philosophical way of talking about science, because that's the way it used to be referred to as. So science and language. But so they're inexorably connected, but it's not as if the scientific method can be transferred to the method of figuring out language, and the method of language can't be transferred to the scientific method to figure out scientific problems, which makes total sense, right? And it's not a communication of concepts. It's not like science and language are communicating with each other and changing the way they influence each other. It's not that sort of thing the way that people usually talk about it. And it's not as if like you have a scientific model or language model, you can transfer the language model to science to figure out scientific problems, and it's not as if you can use the scientific model or even like a scientific model of language and apply it to language in order to scientifically decipher language, basically. So so he continues, nor is it a question of a more general rationality imposing identical forms upon grammatical thinking and upon taxonomia. So I talked about Noam Chomsky the other day, right? He One of his main theories in language is that there's this sort of universal grammar, inherent grammar inside people's brains. So Foucault isn't directly criticizing uh, Noam Chomsky here, because this is probably before Chomsky wrote his famous book on language, although I don't know that for sure, so don't quote me on it. But basically, he's talking about this theory that rationality can help us perform a taxonomy of grammar, like this universal taxonomy in sort of a scientific way, using rational scientific methods to decipher these universal ways that grammar work, which doesn't really make sense, because would that work in terms of different languages across different cultures during different period of histories? Would that remain the same as migration changes the different types of people who are in a certain area, which changes the language a lot sometimes from one place to another place, especially if we're talking about across history. So the so you can't use science to decipher language, basically. You can't use rational scientific methods to form a taxonomy of grammar that's in all of our heads. So he continues, rather, it concerns a fundamental arrangement of knowledge which orders the knowledge of beings so as to make it possible to represent them in a system of names. So basically, he's talking about it's an arrangement. So natural history is an arrangement of knowledge, so which arranges the knowledge of beings so it can make the knowledge able to be represented by a system of names. So, like you said, it's a taxonomy. This it's like a scientific system. This grammar forms these words, and then these words, these root words, form these other words. Well, that's not how grammar works exactly, but you know what I mean. So it's a way, like natural history you could say, is a way of arranging knowledge. And it's not necessary, but it's not like, it's a way of arranging knowledge that we already might know about language. So it's not allowing us to discover new knowledge about language, it's helping us arrange the knowledge that we already know about language. So he continues, there were doubtless in this region we now term life many inquiries other than attempts at classification, many kinds of analysis other than that of identities and differences, but they all rested upon a sort of historical a priori. So remember, I've talked about a priori many times before. It's basically like a claim that is just inherently assumed to be true, and there is no justification for it. So, but like, it's basically the same as a faith claim. Like, if you define faith claim as taking something on faith and just assuming that something is true without proving it, if you use it in that way, then basically an a priori claim is kind of a faith claim. So all of this knowledge and taxonomy of knowledge about language rested upon a historical a priori. So basically, all of this scientific knowledge about language is based on a faith claim, we can say, which authorized them. So I think he probably means like scientific science, or maybe even more properly, the scientific authorities, because we know from his book History of Sexuality that he talks about institutions of the modern era, and one of them, along with religion and government, one of the main ones is science. So he's probably talking about not necessarily scientists, but the institution of scientists rested upon a historical a priori or faith claim, which authorized them in their dispersion and their singular and divergent projects, and rendered equally possible all the differences of opinion of which they were the source. So see, since there's this historical assumption that we can scientifically learn about and classify knowledge about language, this authorized scientists to go into search in different directions in terms of science, and render equally possible all the differences of opinion of which they were the source. So it means that all of these people go into their different fields of scientific theories of languages, and they all basically propose their own theories. And one intellectual is like, this is my theory, this is correct, all those other guys are wrong. And then everyone else says, I'm correct, all those other guys are wrong. So it's not like actually a scientific method. It's like this supposed scientific arrangement of knowledge is based on ideologized faith claims of scientists who prefer investigating one theory over another theory. So them preferring to operate that theory over one theory means all of these theories could be possible, so none of them are absolutely scientifically objectively true. Basically, none of the theories of language are absolutely scientifically true forever. So this a priori does not consist of a set of constant problems uninterruptedly presented to men's curiosity by concrete phenomena, or as so many enigmas. Um, Yeah, that's kind of self-explanatory. Nor is it made of a certain state of acquired knowledge laid down in the course of the preceding ages and providing a ground for the more or less irregular, more or less rapid progress of rationality. So basically, this idea of continuous scientific progress and innovation across history, this is, of course, a major assumption of the Enlightenment in the modern era, mainly in like 1600s to 1800s Europe he tends to focus on. And so it's this idea that there's this increasing progress of rationality in science, and humanity is becoming more scientific and rational, so we're figuring out more objective knowledge about the truth. So this plays into this actually does not lead to objective truth, I think he might imply, at least, because this scientific assume this assumption that there's this continuous arc upward of rational scientific progress, as people like Steven Pinker talk about, right? Like, well, he talks about specifically moral progress, like it's gone upward throughout the 20th century in spite of World War One and Two, and especially so after that. But this is, a lot, and Foucault is far from the only intellectual to criticize this type of theory, which is very old, and Steven Pinker is far from the only person to posit it, right? So basically, this idea that there's an inevitable curve upwards of scientific progress and scientific rationality and the scientific method to use to figure out objective answers to all of our problem is actually based on an a priori slash faith claim that that this one theory applies objectively to this, and not all of the and all of the other ones are incorrect. So basically, this idea that there's this inevitable arc upward of moral and rational and scientific progress is incorrect because it's based on a faith claim. So he continues, it is doubtless not even determined by what is called the mentality or the framework of thought of any given period. If we are to understand by that the historical outline of the speculative interest, beliefs, or broad theoretical options of the time. I think he's kind of just reiterating what he just said there in a way. So this a priori claim or assumption, we can say, is what in a given period delimits in the totality of experience a field of knowledge, defines the mode of being of the objects that appear in the field, provides man's everyday perception with theoretical powers, and defines the conditions in which we can sustain a discourse about things that is recognized to be true. I think there are a few important parts to focus on there. So this assumption delimits in the totality of experience a field of knowledge. So it basically, like I was saying, it posits a major overarching theory, for example, we can say in terms of the scientific model of language. So a total experience, like this one monolithic scientific way of looking at language is the only way that we can possibly figure it out, right? And uh, and defines the mode of being of objects that appear in the field. So it defines, like, this one supposedly objective scientific theory of language uh, defines the way that we perceive objects. Think about that. This scientific theory of knowledge uses an assumption to tell us the way we are supposed to define objects. So if this theory tells us how we are supposed to define objects, does our brain know that we define objects that way, or do we just assume this based on the theory, and then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy? Like, that seems to be much more likely to Foucault, is what I would say. So it provides man's everyday perception with theoretical powers and defines the conditions in which he can sustain a discourse about things that is recognized to be true. So if this objective scientific theory of language allows us to have these theoretical powers, to use our magical scientific powers to continue increasing in scientific innovation and increasing in scientific progress with the scientific method to figure out an objective scientific theory and model of language is recognized to be true, like capital T true, objectively true. So in the 18th century, the historical a priori, or this assumption that provided the basis for inquiry into controversy about the existence of genera, the stability of species, and the transmission of characters from generation to generation, you could say basically like he's kind of describing evolution, or even the evolution of science, perhaps, was the existence of a natural history. Yeah, the existence of natural history, you could say science. The organization of a certain visible existence as a domain of knowledge, the definition of the four variables of description, the constitution of an area of adjacencies in which any individual being whatever can find its place. So according to this a priori assumption that there's an inevitable arc forward and upward of scientific innovation and progress, and a scientifically, objectively true theory about language. Uh, this defines this means that we can use a scientific theory to help show humanities their place in the world. So eventually we'll use the inevitable progress of scientific innovation and the rational scientific method to scientifically tell us how we are going to place ourselves in the world. You see how this leads to authoritarianism and even eugenics or something, which is the to Foucault basically the inherent authoritarian nature of systems that makes him kind of sound more like an anarchist a lot of the time. I say that the system of science can be just as authoritarian as the system of religion or government can get. Obviously there's like fascism and communism for government, there's theocracies, crusades, innumerable examples for religion, and scientific like, like the Nazi state claimed to be a scientific state in some ways, and that's far from the only example. Like eugenics and forget what that fucking science is, but that skull measuring science that was assumed to be objectively true and was used to label black people and anyone other than white Anglo-Saxon Europeans as like inferior in some way. Um, so that's how we can see authoritarian tendencies of government, science, and religion. So natural history in the classical age is not the constitution of an area of adjacencies in which any individual being, whatever, can find its place. So that's not the way the world was, but it's the way the scientific method and scientific progress expects it to be to the institution of science. So, natural history in the classical age is not merely the discovery of a new object of curiosity. So, like the Enlightenment was not just an obsession with the scientific method, basically. It covers a series of complex operations that introduce the possibility of a constant order into a totality of representations. So, like I said, everything in its proper place. Science can science can tell us the way that we can organize a society correctly, organize everything in the world. There will be order in the world. This sounds kind of like religion, doesn't it? Everything in its proper order, everything in its place. Jordan Peterson talks all the time about order being so important because it defeats chaos and all this shit, and he doesn't focus at all on the importance of chaos and how chaos and order balance each other out, and they both have pros and cons, and they both have positive and negative effects on each other. But anyway, the scientific method will put all of our world into its proper order and have everything in its proper place with this religion of science, or scientism, or I mean, like specifically a philosophy, logical positivism is kind of the thing what that Sam Harris practices and other militant atheists without even realizing that they're doing it. So anyway, the classical age covers a series of complex operations that introduce the possibility of a constant order into a totality of representations. It constitutes a whole domain of empiricity as at the same time describable and orderable. So not just so scientific empiricism, like using our observations and scientific tools to observe results of scientific experiments, allow us to describe and order the way that society should be organized with the authoritarian system of science. Empirical science will save the world and solve all of our problems, right? That's how you can get into an ideology of science. So what makes it akin to theories of language, the theory of natural history, also distinguishes it from what we have understood since the 19th century by biology, and causes it to play a certain critical role in classical thought. We can say like more of a scientific focus on on biology and evolution by that, like he was alluding to earlier, as I said, that there's this inevitable scientific progress of learning more about evolution. And this doesn't mean that evolution is wrong, of course, but we've also talked about a separate part of this book in which he's talking about evolution and alternative theories of evolution that I didn't even know about before. There were all of these all like people had been positing the theory of evolution in different ways that it would have been organized long before Darwin. And there's also Lamarckian evolution, which just works in a slightly different way. And that doesn't mean it's subjectively scientifically correct and Darwin is wrong, but he points out that there are these alternative scientific theories, and then you go in this direction and it can lead you astray. It doesn't necessarily mean it's subjectively scientifically correct. It's just by far the most likely to be true in the case of evolution or something like that, right? And like he was saying, science and language are separate domains. But anyway, I think the overarching point in this is that knowledge is fake. Like we think it's objective scientific truth, but we don't actually know that it's scientific truth because the institution of science has, in an authoritarian way, spread this narrative and like faith claim, a priori assumption that there's inevitable scientific progress that will save the world and solve all of our problems. And basically, like it also reminds me of base of well, not Foucault himself, but there's this idea of the simulacrum with people who like to philosophy nerd out about the Matrix know about it's it's Baudrillard's idea, and it's kind of basically what Foucault is talking about here, but obviously he's not a so-called postmodernist. He's actually a so-called post-structuralist, as I've explained many times before, because partial for one of the many innumerable reasons is that he never used the word simulacrum, and Baudrillard used that, but you could say that it's apt for what Foucault is talking about here. And of course, the Matrix misrepresented Baudrillard's idea of a simulacrum, uh, basically, but you could say it's like some sort of simulation of knowledge. So what we see as scientific objective knowledge is actually a simulation of knowledge. And that's all why to Foucault, knowledge is fake.